Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the inaugural New South Wales State of Volunteering Report. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am standing, that is the Wiradjuri people, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands right across Australia. We are broadcasting from east to west, and it's wonderful that I extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us this afternoon, and to elders past, present and emerging. We are very thrilled to be here. It seems like a long time coming, this report, but it is here and we're really thrilled to be able to present it to you today. I'd like to welcome in particular the Honourable Alistair Henskins, Minister for Families, Communities and Disability Services, Anthony Shannon and Kelly May from the Department of Communities and Justice, Helen Freeland, the Chairperson of the Centre for Volunteering, and the other board members of the Centre who are with us today, members of the State of Volunteering Project Advisory Group, Paula Duncan AM, our ambassador. We also have volunteering peaks CEOs from Queensland, Mara Basanovic, and from the ACT, Jean Geezer, and also fellow peak CEOs who are with us this afternoon. I'm very pleased to also say that we have a number of our former New South Wales Volunteers of the Year with us today. David and Eleanor Blows, Andrew Bredden, Ronnie Bogner, Luke Chesworth, Aisha Dalkich, Kylie Elliott, Kim Hill, Emily Milton-Smith, Mark Rushton and Robert Fitzgerald. Great to have you all here today, and thank you all for being here to launch this report. It is a milestone event for New South Wales, and the findings will support our work and that of others right into the future. I sincerely thank the Department of Communities and Justice for commissioning this work and for all their support in bringing it to fruition. I also thank Paul Muller and Claire Ellis from the Institute of Project Management for the report itself and for all of their work over the last year or so in bringing it to life. And the members of the Project Advisory Group who are with us this afternoon, Jenny Allen, Claire Bevis, David Brett, Luke Chesworth, Jane Davies, Kelly May, Lauren Miles, Kate Munro and Kim Shaw. I thank you all for your support, for your guidance and for your expertise throughout this project. If you have not already done so, you will have the link to the website and also the link to the report that you should have received at 2 o'clock so that you can look through the report and follow some of the statistics as they unfold this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to invite the Honourable Alistair Henskins, Minister for Families, Communities and Disability Services and the Minister responsible for volunteering to officially launch the New South Wales State of Volunteering Report. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Gemma. And can I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting. Yeah, it's with great pleasure that I join you today online as Minister responsible for volunteering. I often describe volunteers as the glue that keeps our community together. That is because volunteers are everyday people who put their community above themselves. I'm very proud to say that I was a volunteer well before I became a Member of Parliament. I proudly volunteered in sporting organisations as a coach, manager and administrator, and in my kids' school as a P&C member and president, canteen volunteer and fundraiser. As a volunteer, I followed the example set by my parents, my older siblings, my friends and their parents who were also volunteers. My father and mother were both active in my primary school and broader community. My father was the P&C president of my primary school only a few years after he immigrated to Australia with English as a second language and all of the challenges that presented. I say to our new Australians that the best way to settle into our country is to become a volunteer. Volunteering is not only intrinsically good, but on a personal level as a volunteer, it gives rise to a sense of achievement, personal satisfaction, and lifelong friendships. I have had volunteers help form the person that I've become and have been privileged to see not only my kids grow up, but help their friends grow up too, as I've had an involvement in their sport or school activities. I was fortunate to study overseas and obtain a Master of Laws degree on a scholarship provided by one of our many voluntary service organisations, Rotary International. So I'm very excited and proud to be involved today in a landmark day for volunteering in our state. The launch of the first New South Wales State of Volunteering report is an important milestone for our community. The report is an in-depth investigation into the value of one of our most important social assets, which is volunteering in our state. We have always known that volunteering is important and large, but we now have real data on the true scale and impact of volunteering. We rely on the contributions of volunteers and volunteer organisations because it is their efforts that make our state a better place to live, our communities more resilient, and our economy more robust. I'm excited that the true value of volunteering has been so transparently revealed. Volunteering adds tens of millions of dollars to our state economy every year. We now know that there are 4.9 million dedicated individuals giving significant amounts of their time each year, 1.5 billion hours of their time as volunteers to our collective well-being. And vitally, the voices of young people have for the first time in Australia in a State of Volunteering report been articulated. This is essential for the future health and well-being of volunteering because we need more young people to get active and get involved. Volunteers generate a remarkable impact in so many areas, be it in sport, health, education, animal welfare, the environment, emergency services, and who can forget the Rural Fire Service during our bushfire season recently. Arts and culture, community services, aged care, and scientific research, to name but a few. Volunteers often go unrecognised for their efforts because they do it for the community benefit and not for a pat on the back. To all, on behalf of the New South Wales Government, I say thank you. Your efforts are appreciated, they are acknowledged, and now they are valued through this report. The level of collaboration between the Centre for Volunteering, the New South Wales Government, and the Institute of Project Management to bring this report to life is also acknowledged. Without that collaboration, we would not be here today. But looking beyond today, what does the future hold? The vision of the New South Wales Volunteering Strategy 2020 to 2030 is volunteering in New South Wales grows and is vibrant. Everyone can volunteer more often throughout life and their contributions are celebrated. Our vision for the decade is one where communities continue to be strengthened and supported by volunteers, and volunteering is promoted, invested in, and valued. To achieve our vision, we need to continue sharing our stories, working in partnership, inspiring participation, improving our understanding, and investing in it. As the report details, for every dollar we invest in volunteering, it returns $3.30. Our actions under the strategy need to be forward-thinking, and the State of Volunteering report importantly identifies research topics for future investigation. Now is the time for generating awareness of the report's findings, and now is the time for taking action to recognise, support, and grow volunteering and its contributions. The government, community, and private sector all benefit from a healthy, vibrant, and robust volunteering sector. but now I'm sure you're eager to learn more about the report's findings. So in conclusion, I commend the report and the work of all involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And I really honestly thank you very much for your own and your government's support for this report and for volunteering in general. And we really look forward to continuing to work closely with you and the department to support and enable volunteers and volunteering in New South Wales. Everybody here on this call, you are all involved in volunteering in one way or another. And this report provides us with the evidence that we need to continue to support volunteers and volunteering into the future. It is a milestone, as we have said, and we're really thrilled to be presenting this first ever report into the value of volunteering for New South Wales. That value is undeniable, and volunteering, we know, builds social connection, skills, resilience and confidence for individuals, and also volunteering builds stronger and more connected, resilient communities. This is why we need to support it. The State of Volunteering report provides us with the much needed evidence of the true value of volunteering and the contribution of volunteer involving organisations. This is something that we have anecdotally known for a very long time, but this report finally provides us with the actual evidence. As the Minister said, the report reveals that 4.9 million volunteers aged over 18 volunteered in 2020. That is a huge number of people and far outweighs any number that we have used in the past. We now won't be able to underreport volunteering because we have the evidence to prove it. In 2020 alone, volunteers gave over 1.5 million hours of their time to their communities, which is an extraordinary effort. As we all know, 2020 was a pretty challenging year, to say the least, with fires, floods, and then to top it all off, COVID-19. Volunteering actually grew in 2020, which is an amazing effort. The actual value of volunteering for New South Wales is $127 billion. I'll just pause there. A huge number, and something that we have underestimated in the past. This report tells us that that's the figure, and that is an enormous contribution to our communities right across the state. Volunteering, if it were a sector of itself, actually is nearly 4 times larger than the New South Wales public sector and almost exactly the same size as the private sector. That's quite incredible too. While we recognise the efforts of volunteers, this report also provides us with valuable insights into the barriers to volunteering, and hopefully will help us, those of us who are volunteer involving organisations, to break down some of those barriers. The main reason individuals give for not volunteering or not volunteering more is lack of time, and we already know that. That's a challenge that faces us all. Cost is also an issue. In New South Wales, it's costing volunteers on average over $1,900 a year to volunteer. Another astounding figure. Research into volunteer involving organisations and the challenges they face is vital to support the sector into the future. Major issues identified by organisations were volunteer management, access to funding, grants and sponsorship, and volunteer recruitment. In the wake of a very difficult 18 months for our sector and the world at large, this data shows more support is required for organisations to adapt and change in the rapidly evolving environment. These statistics that I've just offered you are really a small sample of the amazing information in this report. And I recommend that you take time after we finish to read the report in full. It provides an extremely valuable and in-depth analysis of our sector, which has previously not been accounted for. I'm really thrilled to have with us this afternoon Paul Muller, who will discuss some of the key findings and insights in the report in much greater depth. Prior to co-founding the Institute of Project Management, Paul enjoyed 15 years of senior management experience across Australia, Asia and Europe in a wide range of businesses. He currently advises a diverse community of public, private and not-for-profit organisations on management issues relating to strategy, risk, projects, operations, marketing and people. Along with Claire Ellis, Paul is the co-author of the New South Wales State of Volunteering report. This report fills another piece of the Australia-wide puzzle. Paul has been involved in reports with Tasmania, Western Australia, Victoria, and in Queensland. At the end of Paul's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so you will have the opportunity to follow up with any questions. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat function, or you can email us on info@volunteering.com.au, and we will share those questions at the end of Paul's presentation. So without further ado, I invite Paul to share his insights. Thank you, Paul.
Cool. Thank you very much, Gemma, Minister, as well, for your kind words and introduction. I suppose now I need to live up to that. So here's the report, and hopefully you can see the screen. And as Gemma indicated, this is the story of $127 billion. So numbers on their own don't have any meaning. Numbers really only have meaning when compared to other things. And this is the story of that journey of how we arrived at the various questions we asked people to arrive at this figure of 127 billion. So the report itself, just to give you an insight into how it's structured, and this is how I'll structure this presentation as well, was divided into 4 sections. The first was understanding the characteristics of volunteering in New South Wales. Who volunteers? How often do they volunteer? Where do they volunteer? Those sort of questions. The second section looks at the profile of volunteer involving organisations. So any organisation, whether they be private, public, not-for-profit, who utilises the time given by volunteers, we asked them about the volunteers they use and how they manage them. The third section, as Gemma indicated, for the first time, looked specifically at youth volunteering. So by youth in this report, we considered people aged 12 to 24 and really wanted to understand, is there any difference between how youth volunteer and the rest of the public volunteer? And as they say on all those clickbait sites, the results will shock you. And finally, we looked at the costs and benefits. So we translated all these sources of value that we could identify and quantified them in a cost-benefit framework to understand more completely what the value of volunteering was to the state. So the first section, the characteristics of volunteer behaviour. To understand this, we did a random online survey of just over 1,100, nearly 1,200 New South Wales residents. It was conducted between February and April of this year. And we had quotas and then weighted for characteristics like gender. So we had an appropriate mix of male, female and others in our gender mix, age. So we looked at 10-year age cohorts, from 18 to 24, 25 to 34, etc., up to 65 plus. We looked at household income quintiles, so the 5 categories of household income. We made sure that that was fairly represented in the survey, as well as location. So we specifically looked at the differences between major cities and other parts of New South Wales, those regional, rural and remote regions, which we treated as a single entity. Now, this was to ensure that the sample of 1,100 odd New South Wales representatives truly reflected the demographic makeup of the state. We also took the opportunity to ask the difference between volunteering in 2019 and in 2020 to understand, among other things, the impacts of things like COVID, the bushfire emergency, and those significant, I guess, altering events potentially as well. So, as has been foreshadowed by both the Minister and Gemma, 4.9 million people over the age of 18 volunteered in New South Wales in 2020, which was a huge result. It's something like 75.9% of the adult population. So 3 out of 4 people self-identified as volunteering in some way, shape or form in the previous 12 months. As the Minister said, that's a total of 1.5 billion hours that were given in the state. And people volunteered on average about 25 hours per month, or just under 6 hours per week is what they were giving. Now, they gave and volunteered in both formal and informal ways. So by formal volunteering, what we mean is volunteering for an organisation, whereas informal volunteering is that social, unorganised volunteering that you might do in the community, such as helping a neighbour, there's something that's not structured. Quite often things like helping a neighbour. Now, in informal volunteering, we excluded volunteering for family members and volunteering for people living in your house, so household members as well. So it's not just, washing the dishes doesn't count as volunteering, sorry, Dad, but things like, cutting the oranges for the soccer team. That might not be a formal thing, that was something that you consider helping out a soccer club. It might just be something for your school team or something, but those are the sort of activities that we're looking at. Other people outside your family and household must benefit. Now, what we found, only 10% of volunteers exclusively gave their time in organisational settings, and 30% of volunteers really only did informal volunteering, which was a really interesting finding as well. And about 60% of the population does a mix of formal and informal volunteering across the year. We also looked at, within this, not just structured volunteering in the sense that, you do something regularly once a week, once a fortnight, once a month or whatever. We also looked at spontaneous and occasional volunteering. So if you did a one-off type volunteering activity, we included that within this. So, you might have helped out once at the school canteen during the year, or you might have gone and helped out at your, at a local theatre production or a music festival. So those are the sort of things that we also captured and included. Now, when we looked at how people volunteered year on year, I'll draw your attention to the bottom line here. 43.9% of people volunteered the same in both years, and 4.8% of people volunteered in 2019, but not 2020. So only volunteered in the previous year, and for whatever reason weren't able to volunteer in the last year. But significantly, and this was quite a surprising finding, 30% of people volunteered more in 2020 than they did in 2019. Whereas only 21% volunteered less. So that accounts for not just people volunteering more, but we actually found they volunteered slightly more hours as well. So volunteering increased in New South Wales in this period. Now, when we looked at, because we had these people, we thought we'd ask them, we had this captive audience, we thought that we'd ask them as well about their motivations for volunteering and their barriers to volunteering. So some of the things that we saw, the main motivation for volunteering, as you'd expect, It was to help others. And, you know, nearly 2/3 of people put that as a motivation for volunteering. People also looked for social connection, as well as to utilise their skills and experience in a different setting, presumably. To support a cause was obviously an important one. And to develop new skills or to gain work experience was a motivation for volunteering. What we also saw is about 47, nearly half of volunteers did so in their local community, on the ground in their local community. So they weren't travelling far to volunteer. But surprisingly, 1 in 3, well, or a third of volunteering was taking place from people's home or online. And as you might expect, in 2020, this number jumped appreciably. There was much more volunteering at home or online, and less volunteering, much less volunteering out of their region, or certainly overseas, which is where, you know, a significant number of people had previously done their volunteering as well. So of those people who do volunteer, we asked and wanted to understand what were their barriers to volunteering more, what prevented them giving more time. And as Gemma indicated, well, half of people said, I'm giving all the time I have. I don't actually have any more time to give as a volunteer. And that's perfectly reasonable when you're giving 6 hours a week. Cost, though, was another big one. So 30% of people roughly said that, you know, I can't afford financially to volunteer more than I do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Health reasons were given as well. So 30% of people gave health reasons for not volunteering more. And 14% of people said, I don't really know how to give more time. I don't know where to give it as well, which was interesting. And finally, transport was a barrier for a number of people as well. And we'll see the significance of that when we start talking about youth and cost as well. For those people who weren't volunteering, who gave no time in the previous 2 years, again, they saw themselves as being quite time poor. Not to the same extent, but certainly time poor. Health reasons were also strongly given, but you'll see that the health reasons for not volunteering more or for not volunteering at all, roughly the same percentage of the population. So, you know, 28%, 30%, 29% for both. This was interesting, though. The not sure how, or the other part of this question was when people responded was they weren't sure how, or they'd never been asked. And 1 in 4 people who aren't volunteering turned around and said, well, I don't know how to volunteer, or no one's actually asked me to volunteer or shown me how. So they're expressing an interest, but just not access to volunteering. So that was quite interesting. And only 1 in 5 people who aren't volunteering actually said, well, I don't want to volunteer. It's not something I'm interested in. And that's perfectly reasonable. We can accept that, but it's a very low percentage. And if we're making, and it gives insight into the mind of a non-volunteer that there's 80% of them, presumably 78.3% of them, who do want to volunteer but have other barriers in their way. And another big reason for these people was also cost, although not to the same extent of people who were actually volunteering and probably had a better appreciation of the true cost of volunteering to them directly. So when we ask people about, you know, how do you see yourself volunteering in 3 years' time? Interestingly, only 43% of people, of people who are actually volunteering now said, yeah, I'll be doing about the same in 3 years' time. Some said volunteering more. About half that number again said they'll be volunteering less. 8% said they wouldn't be volunteering at all, would be giving it away, and 11% were unsure. But that unsure figure jumped significantly with the non-volunteers. So about half said that either would be volunteering or they just weren't sure. And that's a significant number. Only half of non-volunteers said, well, I don't expect to be volunteering then either. And what this shows us, what these figures show us in general terms, is that people are moving in and out of volunteering throughout their life. So you've only got sort of 43.5% of volunteers who are rusted on and have found their set volunteering quota and are sticking to it. other people are coming in and out at different life stages and changing their level or volume of participation in this space. So let's look at volunteer involving organisations. We did an online survey or census really of volunteer involving organisations in the state, and we got over 1,000 valid responses, 814 of whom provided financial data anonymously for us to work with as well, which again will become relevant shortly. And we got a reasonable cross-section of responses among all those sectors that were described before. So who volunteers with these organisations? And we're talking formal volunteering now. So 82% of responding organisations said, yes, we use people aged over 65. And also people who are what we might call underemployed, people who don't work or work less than full time. A very high percentage of those people were volunteering with these organisations as well. Yet people who work full time still made up half of their volunteering cohorts. Skilled professionals as well. So these organisations were looking for skilled professionals with their specific technical skills to bring across. So, you know, they might have been using them to, turn sausages on the barbie, but they might have also been using them in skilled capacities as well. And people aged 18 to 24 were 40-odd% of people. And also current or past program participants. So people, like myself who are too old to play rugby, now referee on the weekend to stay involved. So people who used to participate in programs were continuing on in a volunteering. But interestingly, volunteer involving organisations said that they have a high number of spontaneous or one-off volunteers. And we also saw that these numbers seem to be increasing. People were more likely to volunteer spontaneously or one-off for organisations, more so than they had done in the past. So volunteering organisations, we asked them, well, how do you recruit your volunteers? Word of mouth was the big one. We do our job so well that people talk about us and bring their friends to volunteer as well. So 90% of organisations. Getting involved on the socials was another big one. Just over half of organisations using that or their own website. And the good old-fashioned open days or events, come on down, get to know us, try us out, see what we've got to offer. 1 in 3 organisations doing that, as well as traditional media, so posters and flyers and articles in the newspaper. Other strategies that we used were things like referral by another agency, such as Centrelink, using the volunteer resource centres or the Centre for Volunteering themselves, seek volunteering, and just generally investing in their brand so that, people hear of them, associate them with volunteering, and that brings them, even though they might be advertising or promoting some other activity that they do. So typically we found that organisations were using about 3 different methods at any one time to recruit volunteers. In terms of recognising, engaging and retaining volunteers, personal connections and relationship building was by far the biggest way that organisations managed to recognise and retain their volunteer cohort. Quite a number, just under half, were running out-of-hours gatherings, events or celebrations. Giving awards, certificates, letters of appreciation was a big one. Having really high quality induction and orientation programs we also know is a great way to retain and engage your volunteers longer. And about 35% or just over 1 in 3 organisations reimbursed in some way their volunteers' expenses, which was interesting, which was good. In terms of the issues and valid challenges that the organisations faced, financial viability and sustainability, as well as good governance, were the main organisational issues that the volunteer involving organisations reported. Health and safety and volunteer retention were obviously big too, as well as linked to this idea of financial viability and sustainability, access to funding, grants and sponsorships, as well as risk and insurance were quite big, and legal issues were the top reported external threats, which are probably linked to the ability to find good governance and support on that side of things as well. So the priorities areas of support that VIOs identified were volunteer management. By far, that was where organisations felt they needed the biggest support, as well as access to funding grants or sponsorship, volunteer recruitment, but also how can we better and how can we be supported to do better volunteer appreciation and recognition inside our organisation as well. So there's an awareness that, these aren't things we just, want a handout for, but what are things we can do to actually improve how we deliver services as well. So in terms of, we asked the volunteer involving organisations to look into their crystal balls as well and say, what does the future look like for you? So 36.2%, so just over a third, said they expected more volunteers or about the same. So nearly 7 out of 10 predicted they'd have the same or more volunteers in 3 years' time. And only a small number said they were less, although there was that quite high degree of uncertainty. So, just under 1 in 5 said, I just don't know what volunteers are going to look like. And that probably reflects the uncertain times we're living in as well at the moment. So let's look at our youth. So we defined youth as persons aged 12 to 24. Within our population survey, so the section 1 survey that we did, we had, because of ethical considerations, we were only able to survey people aged 18 and above in that survey, but we had that group of people aged 18 to 24. And then we did convenience surveys, so just random surveys sent out to youth who were involved in volunteering in some capacity in the community. And between them, we had about 480 odd valid responses. And again, to ensure that our responses were representative of the community, they were post-weighted for gender, age, household income, and location. So remember earlier when we said that 75% of adults volunteered in New South Wales? When we looked only at youth aged 18 to 24, we found that 87.6 self-identified as volunteers, so a much greater number than the rest of the population. And on average, they were giving 40.7 hours a month compared to about 25. So there were more of them volunteering a lot more, which was a standout finding in this instance. So in terms of formal volunteering, so volunteering for organisations, youth seem to prefer, when compared to adults aged 25 and above, they seem to be preferring to volunteer for groups like, sports teams, creative groups, hobby clubs. So, a marked difference. That's percentage points. So plus 28.2 percentage points greater. More likely were youth to volunteer for these groups than others. They were also interested in advocacy type, any organisations that, offered advocacy. So, political, religious type organisations as well as for one-off type activities too. They were much more likely to put their hand ups for, volunteering at a festival or in some sort of emergency response capability, as well as for an issue such as a political, environmental or social cause, which is linked to that advocacy. So this is where youths much more strongly preferred to volunteer than people aged 25 and over. When it came to informal volunteering, so that casual, unstructured volunteering that just occurs in the community, they weren't interested in driving people around or personal care or assistance type roles. What they were much more interested in were things like helping out in the community and, passing on their knowledge. So through giving, teaching, coaching or practical advice. Which was quite interesting in that sense. And, perhaps the transport or running errands thing is linked to a lack of access to transport potentially, but there's a lot more that we can dive into, and the report has a lot more detail around these sort of things. But this is compared to volunteers aged 25 and over. Youth were also much more diverse in their volunteering activity. So in formal volunteering, youth typically volunteered. We had a large list which we called the categories of volunteering, that the service that you could give. So in formal volunteering, they were They typically volunteered across 3 different categories, whereas older populations generally only offered up in 2, and slightly less than the norm for 25 and older when it came to informal volunteering. So they much preferred this structured formal volunteering to informal volunteering, we found. And one of the things that was really interesting here, which I'll just pause a sec on, is youth were really massively motivated to volunteer, to learn new things, to learn new skills, gain new knowledge, gain experience, much more so than older volunteers. And the flip side to that is that whereas older volunteers, aged 25 and above, were really interested in volunteering for social connection, youth didn't see that as particularly important. Presumably because they had strong social connection already, they were volunteering for other reasons. And it just gives a little bit of insight into the different motives for volunteering across these groups. In terms of barriers for volunteering, the real standout differences here were youth really felt, more so than the rest of the community, that they just didn't have enough time in the day. Transport, lack of access to transport was a big issue for them as well, a much bigger issue than it was for older volunteers, as you'd expect. But they weren't as worried or concerned by health issues in the same way that older volunteers were. So they were much less likely to say health as a barrier to volunteering compared to others. And again, that no time for them is acutely felt as a barrier, which perhaps again explains why they're more inclined to spontaneously or occasionally volunteer as well. So from the volunteer involving organisation perspective though, when we asked them what they thought about youth volunteering, they actually felt compared to the last 3 years, youth were volunteering less, which is interesting and stands in opposition to what we actually found, that youth volunteer more. So there is potentially a disconnect between the perceptions around youth volunteering from an organisational perspective and the actual behaviours and intent of youth who want to volunteer. So that was quite an interesting finding. This strong 30% of organisations felt that youth are volunteering less now, or that there's less youth out there, the kids today. The other thing too is though that volunteer involving organisations typically offered 1.4 roles to each individual youth. So they had a very narrow set of roles that were defined for youth to volunteer within, whereas we know that youth tell us they prefer and want really diverse volunteering roles. They want 3 different volunteering roles in their life as a rule, whereas the organisations individually are only offering them 1.4, which is perhaps why they're bouncing around organisations potentially and why people perceive that youth are volunteering less. In terms of youth volunteer intentions, compared to other volunteers, they strongly came out saying that they will be volunteering more as opposed to the same. So youth saw themselves volunteering more and more as they got into it, which perhaps is a really good indication that they're enjoying what they're doing, that they love it. But that uncertainty was much greater among youth. So, compared to volunteers aged 25 and over, youth were much more likely to be unsure about whether how much they'd be volunteering over the next 3 years, which again is perhaps explicable by the amount of changes, in life stages that you go through in that age cohort. So this next slide, I'm going to go through really, really quickly because it's for the economists out there, both of you, maybe. But this is where we get into the cost benefits piece. So what we did was we conducted a financial analysis. We also used revealed preference to get into estimates of some of these costs. We used input-output analysis, which I know all of you are familiar with, so I don't have to explain it. Stated preferences to contingently priced returns to industry, and different econometric analyses. That's the boring bit. For those of you who are into that, the report does go into this in a bit more detail, but these are just the different, I guess the reason we put them out here is these are very tried and true and well-respected and understood economic methodologies, and this cost benefit overall approach that we're using is the standard approach for evaluating investment decisions by government at all levels. And it's actually stipulated in legislation that this is how we evaluate investment choices. So the big reveal in terms of the volunteering costs and benefits is that volunteering is not free. And I know, not a shock to people involved in the sector, but we do have this assumption sometimes, this prejudicial assumption, that because people are donating their time, that's all they need to do to be a volunteer. What we actually found is that the average New South Wales resident is reaching into their own pocket to the tune of about $1,900 per year to subsidise their volunteering. I should look this up. Excuse me 1 second. But that's, yeah, about $5.50 per volunteer hour. So for every hour you volunteer, you're going to spend about $5.50 to do it. Now that varies wildly depending on the nature of the activity you're doing, but that's across the board, which is, you know, a significant outgoing investment, given that when you add that to your time, which we'll do shortly, you'll see. Now, only 20% of volunteers are reimbursed in some way for the out-of-pocket expenses they incur. So for 4 out of 5 people, that $1,900 is just an outgoing. And I should be clear too, it's an outgoing, but they're probably happy to pay. They see that as a cost of service. So it's not a prejudicial statement in any way. And for those who are reimbursed, they only receive just over 1/3 of their expenses back. So about $600 of this, So when we look at the direct costs of volunteering, the individuals reaching into their own pocket costs about $8.6 billion per year. Whereas volunteer involving organisations across the board spend, I won't say only spend, but spend about $2 billion. So to subsidise the activity of their volunteers. So, you know, that's 4 times as much that individuals pay as organisations pay, but yeah, organisations are making significant investments themselves into volunteering in the state. Now, as part of this cost-benefit approach, we look at what we call opportunity costs. And an opportunity cost is the value of the next best thing. So if you weren't spending your money on volunteering, you'd be spending it on something else. You'd be going to the movies or buying, going to dinner or buying beer or whatever it is you'd spend with your money if you weren't spending it on volunteering. But you'd also be doing something else with your time. If you weren't spending your time volunteering, you'd be spending your time in some other way as well. And the opportunity cost of volunteers' time, we estimated to be about $27 billion. So what we looked at is, of those people who were volunteering and employed, so not every volunteer was employed, as we saw earlier, but we said you're foregoing income, presumably, by not volunteering. You have the capacity to work an extra hour as opposed to volunteering that hour. So that's that opportunity cost of your time. And those investments, let's just say you took all of this money and just put it in the bank and earned bank interest, because that's in economics what we use as the next best proxy for spending money on something. And that's about $95 million worth of income you've forgone as a community by spending money on volunteering. So the total cost of volunteering, this is important, is $38.2 billion. So there's a lot of money goes out to make volunteering happen. But that creates benefits. And by commercial benefits, we're talking about benefits to employers. Now, the $8 billion that's spent on volunteer, like the volunteers spend, and the $2 billion that volunteer involving organisations spend, that's an extra $10 billion in the economy. And that returns a profit to producers of $2.1 billion. So all those shops and retail outlets and training courses and all that $10 billion and how it's spent creates a profit to businesses in New South Wales of $2 billion, which is impressive. But more interestingly, I think, is when a volunteer goes out and volunteers with an organisation, they acquire new knowledge, new skills, new experiences, which they bring back to their employer. And their employer benefits from those knowledge, skills and experience, which is great because the employer didn't have to pay for it. So we call that a productivity premium. And, you know, through the magic of economics, we estimated this to be worth about $50 billion. So employers and industry in New South Wales are benefiting to the tune of $50 billion from the ancillary acts of their volunteers. Now, other civic benefits, so that spending, that $10 billion in spending, created about $9 billion in wages and taxation for people. So that's because of volunteer expenditure, you know, people had jobs, so the jobs were created, so and taxes were paid to the tune of about $9 billion. But probably the most interesting and important one, though, is the replacement cost of volunteers. So if we had to pay volunteers a fair market wage for their time, that fair market wage would have been about $65 billion, which is huge. And, you know, as Gemma pointed out before, that's, yeah, and we looked at in terms of labour hours, not as opposed to wage bill, but that's about 4 times the size of the public sector in New South Wales, and it's about the wage bill of the private sector, which is huge. So, you know, we talk about the public, private, not-for-profit sectors when we talk about the 3 sectors of the economy. Volunteers are the hidden sector, the hidden 4th sector of the economy, and they're bigger than the others on their own, which is a massively significant finding. Now, for those of you who've been sitting there with your little pocket calculators, that's $127.3 billion worth of value. And as the Minister indicated before, that's for every dollar that's actually invested, we're getting $3.30 worth of, you know, social and economic value returned to the community, which is great because, yeah, if I could be guaranteed that every dollar I invested on the punt, for example, would return me $3.30, I wouldn't have to do economic studies like this. So volunteering is not only a massively profitable, but a very safe investment. So I'm going to take a breath and take a drink of water and throw it open to questions.
I think Luke Chesworth has a question.
Luke.
Thanks, Gemma. Paul, thanks for running us through that. I'm curious about the cost to volunteer figure. I'm just wondering if you can go into in a bit more detail what makes up that $1,900 average per person, and if there's any specific kinds of costs that are associated with preventing people taking up or volunteering more.
Yep, no, really good question. Thanks, Luke. So the number one cost category for people was transport, travel and motor vehicle expenses. So getting to and from our volunteering activity, but potentially too within that, driving, you know, volunteer recipients around within that too. The next biggest category of cost was food and drink, comms, then things like accommodation, etc. You know, overnight accommodation, that sort of thing. So those were the largest categories of cost for people. Everything else was under 10%, things like, you know, memberships, education and training, uniforms, clothing, tools, equipment, that sort of thing. Now, I guess one of the things in this report, it's not my place to, and we didn't correlate the types of expenditure people have with a cost, with being specifically a barrier to things, but that's, you know, something that we can absolutely look at in future reports down the track. But probably an interesting, in terms of how as a sector you can respond to that, yeah, we've obviously spoken about, you know, reimbursement of costs as one way to do it, but that's administrative, bureaucratic, puts the onus on the volunteer who may not feel comfortable asking for a reimbursement when they're already giving their time and they know that the organisation's potentially struggling and to make ends meet or whatever. And people are quite willingly paying these costs, in a lot of circumstances, I'd imagine. But in terms of what volunteering or involving organisations can do is perhaps, if you identify that transport is a big cost or barrier to people participating, then put on transport for them. So preemptively subsidise it, give them a bus pass, fuel voucher, put on transport for them. Those are the sort of things you can do. Similarly, when people are spending so much on food and drink as part of their activity, whether they're buying it for themselves or for the people they're giving their time to, those are the sort of things that as a volunteer involving organisation you can potentially subsidise. And probably a more challenging thing and a more strategic thing that you can potentially do is if we treat volunteering as labour and as a labour-giving sector of the economy, then, I'm not perfectly sure what the mechanism for this might look like, but we give tax incentives to people. We reimburse through the tax system people's, legitimate work expenses. So that's potentially something through advocacy or, relationship with government that we can explore, somehow reimbursing volunteer expenses through the tax system. But that's not something you can pull out of the hat overnight. So I hope that answers your question to an extent, Luke, and a lot more than you asked too. Sorry about that.
We have another question from Louise Gagan. Thanks, Louise.
Hey, Louise.
Thank you. Thanks very much for sharing this information, and what a delight to see some data, quantitative data that reflects. My question is actually a forecast question, and perhaps Gemma for you, if that's okay, or whoever. The question is that how wonderful it was to see an increase in volunteering in 2020, considering the year that everybody just wanted to say goodbye to at the end of 2020. And that's probably in response naturally to COVID and the natural disasters that hit our state, and not to mention the resilience of our wonderful volunteers. I appreciate that the data was collected before the latest lockdown, but I'm just wondering if you've had any feedback from your volunteer organisations or volunteers about the current lockdown that we're in, and if it's impacted on the volunteer sector at all, positively or negatively.
Good question, Louise. Thank you. We certainly have had some evidence from our members and organisations that there has been a significant hit with this current COVID lockdown. And so there is a difference from 2020 to 2021 in particular areas, though. So I've actually got another question coming up for Paul around community transport, because that has definitely been decimated, particularly in regional and remote areas during this current phase of COVID. And there have been quite significant downturns in volunteering in food delivery and so forth in some of the Sydney hard lockdown areas. So while the data is still relevant, we still see a growth in some types of volunteering, but there's a downturn in those others that are requiring the face-to-face, very personal, close contact types of volunteering. So Paul, I'll actually now just direct it to you, because I don't know if you want to say anything more about Louise, but not about Louise, about Louise's question.
I'd only say kind things about Louise.
Yeah, only keep it nice.
Absolutely, always. Yeah. We have got another question here that's related. So I'll just read it to you. Volunteering for the Commonwealth Home Support Program service delivery has been decimated by COVID, especially in rural and regional New South Wales. What strategies can we put in place to rebuild this engagement?
Yeah, look, really good question. Just preempting that, prefacing it a little bit, one of the things, the period when we conducted the survey here, it was at a more optimistic time. We felt that, we were on, for New South Wales residents especially, felt that, we're on top of COVID and stuff. Interestingly, when we did this work in Victoria last year, we surveyed people right in the middle of their second lockdown. That was our survey period. And we saw a much bigger drop-off in volunteering participation, particularly in formal organisational-based volunteering. Now, there was a little bit of pickup in informal volunteering, and I should be really clear that this was a point in time as opposed, and both these surveys were captured at a point in time, which are obviously, those points in time are obviously going to be influenced by external factors like COVID and stuff like that. And I'm sure if we did the survey today in New South Wales, especially where we're getting quite a long period of, with, no foreseeable endpoint, certainly not in terms of a deadline date, we get a very different response. So I think the organisations that you cited, community transport being one, would definitely be feeling it. One of the things we've seen is that, and I hate using those buzzwords like nimble, agile, things like that. But we found a lot of organisations who had volunteers and were basically the structure around which people organised and coalesced. Things like the local tennis club, for example, who couldn't play tennis anymore. Some of those organisations said, all right, where can we engage and where can we help? And we saw this really well done in the bushfires, for example. It's like, okay, we will now, and we saw it in COVID in other places where, okay, we can't play tennis, so let's bake meals and deliver them. So potentially for organisations whose core mission is to do some of these things like baking meals or transporting people, there's other clubs and community organisations who can't engage but want to engage that you can potentially partner with and leverage, their support and services. The other thing too, for community transport organisation, for example, the nature and the way people need to be transported is different. For meal delivery services, you might have different volumes, needs, expectations as well. So managing that plus a disappearing supply of volunteers, it's not that people don't want to volunteer, and we see people picking up the slack with their neighbours and things like that. It's how you can access and engage them and support their volunteering activities and lend structure to it. So like we see now, 10 years ago is a very different case. People used to, in a flood or bushfire, would just show up with mops and buckets. Now, though, we try and organise things a lot better in a crisis management sense so that, we make sure people aren't tripping over each other or putting themselves at risk. We have those coordinating pieces. Perhaps, organisations can step into that breach and, be those organising fulcrums and associate with other clubs. Now, that's just one person's view and one person's opinion. I imagine, the Centre for Volunteering and their numerous experts there have different approaches to doing it. But that's sort of what we've seen in this sort of research before, how people transform their volunteering in times of need. So I hope that helps, Louise.
Thanks, Paul. Colleen Williams.
Hi, Paul. I just had a question regarding the how the data that you've found from the survey compares with the general social survey that comes out.
Yeah, look, really good question. Thank you, Colleen. Now, this is something when we recently did the study in Queensland, it's been a question for a while because the ABS typically comes out and says, about 30% of people volunteer. But in the census, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to doing your census tomorrow night, you'll see in there's a question, did you volunteer in the last 12 months, yes or no? Typically in the census, about 18% of people say they volunteer. In the general social survey, generally we get around 30-35% of people say they volunteer. In our survey, we've got 75% of people saying we're volunteering. Now, before I get into the why it's different, I'll just sort of say, which feels right to you? That only 1 out of 3 people in society are volunteering, or 1 out of 5 people are volunteering, or 3 out of 4 people are volunteering, when you consider the range of volunteering activities. So when we did this in Queensland, we specifically asked a control group the general social survey questions, as well as our questions around volunteering. And where our questions around volunteering differ is we ask people first up, do you do any of these activities? And if you say yes to any of them, hey, you know what, you're a volunteer. And people go, oh, right. Because when you ask someone if they're a volunteer, chances are their first response is, oh, no. because I'm not on the tuck shop roster at school, or, you know, I don't run down to Meals on Wheels once a week. So, but when you actually probe and ask people deeper questions around, well, do you do any of these activities in these settings? It's like, okay, yeah, I do volunteer. Yes. You know, I recognize that as volunteering. So we focus exclusively on volunteering, and we help people understand more completely what volunteering is, whereas the ABS just doesn't have the opportunity in its general social survey. So the volunteering questions are about questions 80 to 95 in a 90-minute survey in the general social survey. Here, we've got a 15-minute survey that's purely focused on volunteering. And that's where we get the differences. We've also repeated this study using, you know, the same or very similar questions in other states, and we consistently find that this is the result. So, but the difference we found isn't so much the questions we ask, it's the methodology we use in asking the questions. So just focusing on volunteering, helping people understand what volunteering is, reveals what we feel is a much more accurate, true picture of volunteering in the community. And the ABS itself acknowledges this, that when they say, well, this is why we get a difference between the census and the GSS, what we're saying, yes, you see the same difference between the GSS and us because we have, you know, the luxury to be able to give more time and space and attention to it.
Thank you.
Great. We've got another question from Kim Hill.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, I just wrote to Zach quickly. So how you going, Paul? Probably back, based on the back of I think it was Louisa's question. So I work in disaster management or on a national level. So I work for the NRRA. So part of that, from information that we're getting across various areas now, my area I can't fault, but other areas, and I'm not going to name them. So there's other LGAs. There's other LGAs that across I'll say the whole nation, that don't know who their volunteers are in their LGA, and on top of that, what their skill set is, you know, and all of that comes into play when it comes to disaster recovery. You know, those LGAs can pull on those different, whether it be, you know, those groups or an individual to come in, and it can be as simple as helping out at a recovery centre or so forth. So is that information also readily available, and is that then also sent out to the LGAs for them to actually, obviously it's up to the individual to update that or provide that information if they want to. There's no obligation, but that definitely would help in that type of thing across the nation. So,
look, and it's a really good point and question. One of the things we found out in conducting this research is just how much we don't know. For example, we don't know still how many volunteer involving organisations there are in New South Wales. We had to guess from, and not guess. Economists don't guess, it's not what they do. But, you know, from the responses, we had to cobble together a picture of and an estimate of the number of volunteer involving organisations in the state. So it's really difficult to quantify. Now, I can speak because we've done work with Tasmania, for example, and down here, Volunteering Tasmania is also at the centre of those databases around volunteers who volunteer in emergency crisis situations, or they play a lead sort of coordinating role in disaster and emergency management volunteering. And it's a challenge for them because it's not until the disaster occurs that people all of a sudden rush in and say, here's my skills, here's my knowledge, you know, how can I help, sort of thing, here's my availability. So I think there absolutely is a place for some sort of national register of volunteering skills. But as soon as I say something like that, people freak out the same way they do around immunisation passports too. So, you know, if there's, you know, and it's not my place to set policy or something like that, but I certainly, I'm not unaware of anything like that, and I see the real benefit of it. And, you know, I'll probably defer the rest of that conversation to Gemma.
Well, the short answer is the data is not available and so therefore can't be shared. But I think there is definitely a case for developing something that would have that data there and make it accessible when the time came, which seems to be all the time now. Yes, so good question, Kim, and we'll put that to government as well.
Just probably, Kim, one of the things I'll just add in there very quickly is one of the things I'll add in really quickly is one of the things we did see is that as we know, people's skills and experience change over the course of their career, and their interests and appetite for different types of volunteering changes, as well as their availability too. So one of the challenges you're going to have in setting up one of these registers is keeping it current and, keeping, because if if you're not updating people's data every sort of 2 or 3 years, that's something you'll need to consider in setting this up. It's a big gig. That's what I'll say. But an important one, a really important one.
Trust me, I know. I've just mapped the whole of New South Wales with every LGA, every police district, everything you can imagine. So, yeah, I can, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're doing good work. Keep that up. Yeah.
Indeed. There's a couple of questions in the chat from Penny York. Firstly, will this be the start of collecting this data regularly to gain some longitudinal perspective, and will the data fold into national data collection? I can answer that very briefly, but Paul, you might want to say something as well. We are certainly hoping that this is just the start of collecting this data on a regular basis. I think it's vitally important that we do have up-to-date statistics and we grow our knowledge over time. So we won't be able to fold this actual data into a full national perspective because we don't have the national perspective yet. But Paul, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. Look, one of the challenges with that is in terms of, as has been indicated, we've done the Eastern Seaboard all within the last sort of 18 months or so on a state-by-state basis. And whereas there's a lot of common data within that we can utilise and share, the last 18 months, I don't know if anyone was paying attention, have been pretty chaotic. And it goes to that point in time situation that I was talking about. So we're not able to, I don't think, with the current situation to say, because the periods where we did our sampling, in Tasmania, we did it just before COVID. In Victoria, we did it right during a lockdown. In Queensland, we did it there was little spot lockdowns happening. In New South Wales, it was almost all past. So in that sense, some of that data, the data around participation is not comparable, but certainly some of the data within that can be aggregated. Having said that, though, from Gemma was kind enough to say at the start that this is the inaugural report. I don't know that you need to do it every year, but certainly Tamsin, as the project manager, is just freaking out there in the corner. But it would absolutely, you've got now 5 states who've done this and see the value in this. And, you've got, those states who've had this, data for a while now are really seeing the benefits of it and using it. And yes, longitudinal data collection would be amazing and awesome. And the other thing too, having nationally consistent standards and, in the same way we do the census as a topical one, or the general social survey, if we were, if the sector was resourced appropriately to do this on a regular rolling basis, you would really get some really good intelligence and insights that you get through things like trend analysis and stuff like that. The one thing I will say, though, I've mentioned these other states, and I will put the caveat around, we're really intentional in saying we're not trying to privilege one sort of volunteering over another. So we're not trying, we're not in the same way, we're not trying to say that volunteering in this capacity is better than volunteering here. We don't want to say, and I don't think we can say from what we've seen, that volunteering is in New South Wales is better than volunteering in South Australia or things like that. So again, that is again a benefit of a national approach where we're all in this together trying to improve the profile, but also the benefit that can be added by our sector. But yeah, New South Wales is best, clearly. Yeah.
I didn't want to say it.
Okay.
There's a question, an economicsy question. How have you calculated and or verified the value of the 127 billion?
Oh God, don't ask me that question, because I'll be here all night and only about one of you will care. No, look, it's a good point, but it is a very legitimate question. The one thing I'll say with this is, because this is a novel space we're working in, so this is the first time we've done it in New South Wales. We take that economic tendency towards conservatism. I'm really comfortable saying that this is an underestimate of the value of volunteering, because if we need this, like these findings, not only to pass, the Sydney Morning Herald test or the pub test, we also needed to pass the Treasury test. Because as we've said, cost-benefit analysis is the approach preferred by government at all levels to analysing and making investments in policy. What I can say is we've done this work and applied this methodology a lot, not just in the volunteering sector, but also in community sport. So just in New South Wales, for example, we looked at the value of regional academies of sport. We've looked at the value of live music, specifically in Sydney as well. But also we've done a national work with APRA around that. We've also looked at, with organisations like the City of Sydney around community, around theatre spaces and other creative spaces and creative industries as well. So our methodology is fairly tried and true and tested, not just with public sentiment and opinion, but also with Treasury. And the challenge for me as an economist and a nerd in this space has been making it relatable to non-economists and telling the story of how that value is created. So to the person who asked the question, I genuinely apologise for not recalling your name. But please read the report, please go through it. And if you do have any questions, when we did it in Queensland, there was a member of their board who was an economist for Deloitte. We sat down and spent hours talking about it and the methodology and bonded over that. I'm really happy to answer any questions and, one day hopefully share a coffee with you and go through it all in a lot of detail.
And any final questions?
Sorry, Paul. I have a question just in relation to maybe the report, adding to the report moving forward. Is there any consideration about assessing the benefit of companies that give their staff the ability to go and work a day in the community? Like, what benefit is that to the volunteering side of things? And also, is that a driver of more younger people actually doing the volunteering?
Look, really interesting question. We've kind of started that. We're kind of showing companies and quite intentionally trying to show companies the benefit of your employees volunteering. They're bringing back that $50 billion worth of benefit to you. One of the things we've seen, though, and one of the things that volunteer involving organisations have reported, is that over the last 3 years in New South Wales, corporate volunteering has declined. So corporations giving companies giving their staff paid time to volunteer, essentially. Now, this is a broader macroeconomic thing, but when businesses have confidence, when they're doing well, they're more likely to invest in these sort of activities and programs. And when things are uncertain or when things are tight, like they are at the moment, they're more likely to cut those sort of activities off. Now, what that suggests is that companies are doing it for philanthropic reasons. They're doing it to give back. But what we've started to show is that there's actually economic and financial benefit to companies volunteering their staff in this way. So I 100% agree that more work can be done in this space to make it more explicit and obvious to companies that it's more than just a branding activity to get your volunteer to get your staff volunteering. There's actually real direct, social welfare, but also, profit in sending your staff to volunteer. So yeah, I'm with you on that one, Gay.
Any final questions? Okay. Oh, this is a question.
Yep.
From Aisha. Is there any traction of the idea of tax incentives with government and Treasury? There has been discussion, and so there's quite a lot of talk going on about what can be done to attract people to volunteer in particular areas, and also to offset those costs that we've raised today that volunteers incur in the process of volunteering. So it's an ongoing discussion, there was another question around this New South Wales government strategy and support for example, volunteer management. There is definitely support there for training for organisations and groups around volunteer management, best practice. Obviously, for most of you, it would be obvious. The Centre for Volunteering actually runs the certificates in volunteer management. So part of what we're funded for is to share that information and share that knowledge and training across the sector. So that is happening.
Just on that ATO question, the tax incentive question, the challenge that I guess the ATO will expect the volunteering sector to address is how do we assess legitimate applications for a rebate or benefit versus people scamming the system? Because the ATO, it's just the philosophical mindset is everyone's out to rip us off. But we do manage this through things like, sports vouchers for kids and stuff like that. So probably the best way to do this will be through some sort of voucher system. And we've seen, through the pandemic, a greater willingness of government to accept vouchers as a way to stimulate economic activity through, the dining vouchers and, travel vouchers and things like that around the country. So probably voucher systems are probably the best way. So you get like a standard rebate if you're a volunteer, and you just need some way of authenticating that. Because, basically the ATO, like all government agencies, has a limited budget. And to create a whole new compliance space around this is terrifying for them when it's not resourced. So we have to come up with the simplest, easiest, most universal and kind of bulletproof way of doing it. And then, groom our beards as they grow while we're waiting for this to happen. Sorry, Jim. Just sort of flag the challenges and why you might not be why you can't just ask and receive in that space. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Paul. There's another question. To what extent was diversity measured in the survey?
Yeah, look, we looked at, we did ask questions around diversity. Unfortunately, the nature of our sample size means that, with 1,100 odd people, when we look at communities, whether they're cold communities or, gender diverse communities or sexually diverse communities or whatever they are, they make up, in relative terms, small percentages of the population, which means, we might get, 40 gender diverse people responding to the survey. It's really risky to extrapolate and make assumptions based on that very small sample. So again, we are to some extent representative of that. However, we need larger sample sizes before we can clearly say, Aboriginal communities volunteer in this way. We can't even do it for at the moment for, things like household income, and stuff like that. This goes back to the idea of having a national study. If we have a national study that's looking at the states and then the national picture as a whole, ideally we've got through that large enough samples that we can do deeper dives into the data. And the only way we were able to report on youth in the way we have in this report is we supplemented it with that convenient sample of an extra, nearly 400 people to build our sample out to something that's a little bit more rigorous. So larger sample sizes is the way we address that in future. And again, that conservative means I'm really cautious to extrapolate from our current data on that. But national studies with larger samples will absolutely fix that.
I'm very conscious of the time. Any just final questions?
The other thing too, per Gemma or even approach us directly, connect with me on LinkedIn or something. Really happy, to answer questions in this space, beyond the life of the report. I think Gemma, we were going to do another follow-up session shortly, which I'm sure you're going to flag.
Just about to flag that.
Yeah, so this isn't a once and done. This wasn't your only opportunity. I really look forward to engaging with you, continuously beyond this.
Thank you, Paul. And that brings it to a nice conclusion. I sincerely thank Paul and Claire Ellis, who is on the call as well, for their fantastic work on this report. I know we probably sounding a little bit over enthusiastic, but we are really thrilled that we have this document. And look at it, it looks fantastic. The food bank people there on the cover, thanks Luke, looking great, great stats. We've also produced, let me just reach over my desk, a summary piece, which is really, would be very useful for people just to have it on hand. And I'm sure you'll remember those figures because they're pretty mind-blowing, but if you don't, then those documents are available, and we will print more, but we thought no point if we can't all be together to actually hold the book. So please join me in thanking Paul for all of his time and effort this afternoon, and Claire as well. In the process of compiling this report, we drew on the support, guidance and expertise of a number of amazing people who took part in the project advisory committee from a diverse range of volunteer organisations and groups. I sincerely want to thank you all for that contribution over the past 6 months, and there was considerable contribution, and also for your ongoing support for being here this afternoon. I also extend that thanks to the Honourable Alistair Henskins, the Minister responsible for volunteering, for being here today, but also for his support in presenting this report, and the Department of Communities and Justice for all they have done, in particular to Kelly May, who has been a real champion for the report and for volunteering in general. And last but by no means least, I really want to say thank you to Tamsin Quinn and her team and all of the team at the Centre for Volunteering for literally bringing this report to life. Thank you, Tamsin, well done. And I promise we won't be doing it every single year, because I know that would not be a great idea. So where to from here? As Paul has just flagged, the state of volunteering data identifies what VIOs need and provides information for them to benchmark, plan, and importantly, inform their volunteer management practices. We are going to begin our support for organisations with a free workshop on the 23rd of August. It will be on Zoom. That will hopefully help organisations to even better understand this report, and also to get some insights into how the data can be used to support your organisations in more detail. So 23rd of August, Paul will be joining us again for the workshop, and it will be a deeper dive into the report and what the data is and how it can be used. So the details for that are on our website, and you can register there. And we do encourage you to, please, because hopefully by then you will have had time to read the report and perhaps have come up with other questions. If in the meantime you would like to ask some questions, please email info@volunteering.com.au with any questions, and we'll endeavour to get back to you with that. This report really has informed us as the peak body what we need to do to further support volunteer involving organisations, and also in our advocacy work with all levels of government, addressing issues such as financial viability, sustainability, governance, and access to funding, grants and sponsorship. So that will form part of our work going forward. The report is also a good starting point for future research, and we certainly intend to collaborate with other organisations in New South Wales to develop these statistics and this data, and also right across Australia to more fully have the picture of volunteering and its value. So we will certainly keep you informed of all of that. There's a lot of work now to be done now that we have the evidence base, and to help us move forward from an informed position, which is a really fantastic way to be, and we are very, very pleased with that. To achieve this, we need a unified, committed, whole of government, whole of business, whole of community approach. We hope that you will all join in and work with us at the Centre for Volunteering to help achieve the best for volunteers and our state.